Hello, guys. Welcome to Psyched Minds. I am back again after the break. We are reading We the Living by Anne Rand, and we are on part 2 of the book. Part 2, chapter 1, or we could say it's chapter 18, right? Yes. Part 2, chapter 1. It was St. Petersburg. The war made it Petrograd. The revolution made it Leningrad. It is a city of stone, and those living in it think not of stone brought upon a green earth and piled block on block to raise a city, but of one huge rock carved into street, bridges, houses, and earth brought in handfuls, scattered, ground into the stone to remind them of that which lies beyond the city. Its trees are rare strangers, sickly foreigners in the climate of granite, forlorn and superfluous. Its parks are reluctant concessions. In spring, a rare dandelion sticks a bright yellow head through the stones of its embankments, and men smile at it incredulously and condescendingly as at an impudent child. Its spring does not rise from the soil. Its first violets and very red tulips and very blue hy- hyacinths come in the hands of men on street corners. Petrograd was not born, it was created. The will of a man raised it where men did not choose to settle. An implacable emperor commanded into being the city and the ground under the city. Men brought earth to fill a swamp where no living thing existed but mosquitoes, and like mosquitoes, men died and fell into the grunting mire. No willing hands came to build the new capital. It rose by the labor of soldiers, thousands of soldiers, regiments who took orders and could not refuse to face a deadly foe, a gun or a swamp. They fell, and the earth they brought and their bones made the ground for the city. Petrograd, its residency, stands on skeletons. Petrograd is not in a hurry. It is not lazy, it is gracious and leisurely, as befits the freedom of its vast streets. It is a city that threw itself down amid the marshes and pine forests, luxuriously, both arms outflung. Its squares are paved fields, its streets are as broad as tributaries to the Neva, the widest river to cross a great city. On Nevsky, the capital of the capital street, the houses were built by generations past for generations to come. They are set and unchangeable like fortresses. Their walls are thick and their windows are tiers of deep niches, niches, niches rising over wide sidewalks of reddish brown granite. From the statue of Alexander the Three, a huge grey man on a huge grey horse, silver rails stretched tense and straight to the Admiralty building far away, its white colonnade and thin golden spire raised like the crown. The symbol, the trademark of Nevsky over the broken skyline where every turret and balcony and gargoyle bending over the street are ageless features of a frozen stone face. A golden cross on a small golden cupola rises to the clouds halfway down Nevsky over the Anikovsky Palace. A bare red cube slashed by bare grey windows, and further, beyond the palace, a chariot raises to the clouds the black heads of its rearing horses, their hoofs hanging high over the street, over the stately columns of the Alexandrovsky Theatre. The palace looks like a barracks. The theatre looks like a palace. At the foot of the palace, Nevsky is cut by a stream, and a bridge arches over its swirling, muddy water. Four black statues stand at the four corners of the bridge. They may be only an ancient and an accident and an ornament. They may be the very spirit of Petrograd, the city raised by men against the will of nature. Each statue is of a man and a horse. In the first one, the furious hoofs of a rearing beast are swung high in the air, ready to crush the naked, kneeling man, his arms stretched in a first effort towards the bridle of the monster. In the second, the man is up on one knee, his torso leaning back. the muscle of his legs, of his arms, of his body ready to burst through his skin as he pulls at the bridle in the supreme moment of the struggle. In the third, they are face to face, the man upon his feet, his head at the nostrils of a beast, bewildered by a first recognition of its master. In the fourth, the beast is tamed. It steps obediently, led by the hand of the man who is tall, erect, calm in his victory, stepping forward with serene assurance, his head held straight, his eyes looking steadily into an unfathomable future. On winter nights, strings of large white globes flare up over Nevsky, and snow sparkles over the white lights like salt crystals. And the colored lanterns of tramways, red, green, yellow, wink, far away, swimming over a soft darkness. And through lashes moist with frost, the white globes look like crosses of long white searchlights on a black sky. Nevsky starts on the shore of the Neva, at a quay as trim and perfect as a drawing room with a red granite parapet and a row of palaces of straight angles, tall windows, chaste columns and balustrades, severe, harmonious, and luxuriously stern in their masculine grace. Divided by the river, Petrograd's greatest mansion, the Winter Palace, faces Petrograd's greatest prison, the Peter Paul Fortress. The Caesar lived in the Winter Palace. When they died, they crossed the Neva. In the cathedral of the fortress, white slabs rose over the graves of the Caesar. The prison stood behind the cathedral. The wall of the fortress guarded the dead Caesars and the Caesar's living enemies. In the long, silent halls of the palace, tall mirrors reflected the ramparts behind which men were forgotten, alive for decades in lonely stone graves. Bridges rise over the river as long humps of steel, with tramways crawling slowly up to the middle and rolling swiftly, clattering down to the other shore. The right bank, beyond the fortress, is a gradual surrender to the city, of the city to that earth, that countryside it has driven out. The Kamenovstrovsky, a broad, quiet, endless avenue, is like a stream full of the fragrance of a future sea, a street where each step is a forecast of the country to come. The avenue and the city and the river end at the islands, where the Neva breaks among bits of land held together by delicate bridges, where heavy white cones rise in tiers edged with dark green over a deep silence of snow, and branches, fir branches, and bird footprints alone break the white desolation. And beyond the last island, the sky and sea are an unfinished watercolor of pale grey with a faint greenish band smeared across to mark a future horizon. But Petrograd also has side streets. Petrograd's side streets are of colorless stone rain, washed into the grey of the clouds above and of the mud below. They are bare as jail corridors. They cut each other in naked corners of square buildings that look like prisons. Old gateways are locked at night over mud-swollen ruts. Little shops frown with faded signs over turbid windows. Little parks choke with consumptive grass into which mud and dust and mud again have been ground for a century. Iron parapets guard canals of refuse thickened water. On dark corners, rusty icons of the Madonna are nailed over forgotten in tin boxes, begging coppers for orphanages. And farther up the Neva rise forests of red brick chimneys, spewing a black cloud that hung over old, stooping wooden houses over an embankment of rotting logs at the placid, indifferent river. Rain falls slowly through the smoke. Rain, smoke, and stone are the theme song of the city. Petrograd's residents wonder sometimes at the strange bond that hold them. After the long winter, they curse the mud and the stone and cry for pine forests. They flee from the city as from a hated stepmother. They flee to green grass and sand and to the sparkling capital of Europe. And as to an unconquerable mistress, they return in the fall, hungry for the wide streets, the shrieking tramways and the cobblestones, serene and relieved, as if life were beginning again. Petrograd, they say, is the only city. Cities grow like forest, like weeds. Petrograd did not grow. It was born, finished, and complete. Petrograd is not acquainted with nature, it was the work of man. Nature makes mistakes and takes chances. It mixes its color and knows little of straight lines. But Petrograd is the work of man who knows what he wants. Petrograd's grandeur is unmarred, its squalor unrelieved. Its faces are cut clearly, sharply, they are deliberate, perfect with the straightforward perfection of man's work. Cities grow with the people and fight for the place at the head of cities and rise slowly up the steps of years. Petrograd did not rise. It came to be at the height. It was commanded to command. It was a capital before its first stone was laid. It was a monument to the spirit of man. Peoples know nothing of the spirit of man, for peoples are only nature, and man is a word that has no plural. Petrograd is not of the people. It has no legend, no folklore. It is not glorified in nameless songs down nameless roads. It is a stranger, aloof, incomprehensible, forbidding. No pilgrims ever traveled to its granite gates. The gates had never been opened in warm compassion to the meek, the hurt, and the maimed, like the doors of the kindly Moscow. Petrograd does not need a soul, it has a mind. And perhaps it is only a coincidence that in the language of the Russians, Moscow is she, while Petrograd has ever been he. And perhaps it is only a coincidence that those who seized on the power in the name of the people transferred their capital to the meek Moscow from the haughty aristocrat of cities. In 1924, a man named Lenin died and the city was ordered to be called Leningrad. The revolution also brought posters to the city's walls and red banners to its houses and sunflower seed shells to its cobblestones. It cut a proletarian poem into the pedestal of the statue of Alexander III and put a red rag on a stick into the hand of Catherine II in a small garden off Nevsky. It called Nevsky Prospect of October 25th and Sadovaya a cross street, street of July 3rd. In honor of dates it wanted remembered, and at the intersection, hefty conductoress yell in the crowded tramways, corner of October 25th and July 3rd, terminal for yellow tickets, new fare citizens. In the early summer of 1925, the State Textile Trust put out new cotton prints, and women smiled in the streets of Petrograd, women wearing dresses made of new material for the first time in many years. But there were only half a dozen patterns of prints in the city. Women in black and white checks passed women in black and white checks. Women in red dotted white met women in green dotted white. Women with spirals of blue on a grey dress met women with the same spirals of brown on a tan dress. They passed by like inmates of a huge orphanage, frowning, sullen, uncomfortable, losing all joy in their new garments. In a store on Nevsky, the State Porcelain Trust displayed a glistening window of priceless china, a white tea service with odd, fuzzy, modern flowers engraved in thin black by the hand of a famous new artist. The service had stood there for months. No one could afford to buy it. Windows sparkled with foreign imitation jewelry, strings of flower wax, beads, earrings of bright celluloid circles, the latest fashion, protected by a stupendous price from the wistful women who stopped to admire them. In a street off Nevsky, a foreign bookstore had been opened. A window 2 floors high flaunted the glossy, radiant, incredible covers of volumes that had come from across the border. Bright awnings spread over Nevsky's wide dry sidewalks, and barometers sparkled in the sun with the clear, piercing fire of clean glass. A huge cotton billboard stood leaning against a building, presenting the tense face, enormous eyes, and long, thin hands of a famous actor painted in bold brush strokes under the name of a German film. Pictures of Lenin looked down at the passerby, a suspicious face with a short beard and narrow oriental eyes, draped in red bunting and mourning crepe. On street corners in the sun, ragged men sold saccharine and plaster bursts of Lenin. Sparrows chirped on telephone wires, lines stood at the doors of cooperatives. Women took off their jackets and in short-sleeved, wrinkled blouses offered flabby white arms to the first heat of the summer sun. A poster hung high on a wall. On the poster, a huge worker swung a hammer towards the sky, and the shadow of the hammer fell like a huge black cross over the little buildings of the city under his boots. Kira Arganova stopped by the poster to light a cigarette. She took a paper box from the pocket of her old coat and with two straight fingers, swiftly without looking, swung a cigarette into her mouth. Then she opened her old handbag of imitation leather and took out an expensive foreign lighter engraved with her initials. She flicked a brief little flame, hurled a jet of smoke from the corner of her mouth, and slammed the bag shut over the lighter. She jerked the frayed cuff to her coat sleeve and glanced at a sparkling watch on a narrow gold band. She swung forward, the high heels of her slippers rang hurriedly, resonantly down the granite sidewalk. Her slippers were patched, her legs displayed the tight, sheer luster of foreign silk stockings. She walked towards an old palace that bore a red, five-pointed star over the entrance and an inscription in gold letters: District Club of the All Union Communist Party. Its glass door was severely immaculately polished, but the latch on its garden gate was broken. Weeds grew over what had been gravelled walks, and cigarette stubs rocked softly in an abandoned fountain around a dejected marble cupid with a greenish patch of rust across its stomach at the dry mouth of an urn. Kira hurried down deserted walks through a thick, neglected green tangle that drowned the clatter of tramways outside. Blue pigeons fluttered lazily into the branches at the sound of her steps, and a bee rocked on a heavy purple tuft of clover. A giant regiment of oaks stood with arms outstretched, hiding the palace from the eyes of the street. In the depths of the garden stood a small two-storied wing linked to the palace by the bridge of a short gallery. The windows of the first floor were broken, and a sparrow sat on a sharp glass edge, jerking its head sidewise to look into the mouldy, deserted rooms. But on a windowsill of the second floor lay a pile of books. The heavy hand-carved door was not locked. Kira went in and swung impatiently up the long stairway. It was a very long stairway. It rose to the second floor in a straight line, an endless flight of bare stone steps, cracked and crumbling in little trails of gravel. The stairway had a magnificent white balustrade, but the balustrade was broken. Empty holes gaped over the jagged stumps of marble columns, and their white bodies still lay at the foot of the stairs. Hollow echoes rolled against the walls, against the murals of graceful white swans on blue lakes, of rose garlands, of sensual nymphs fleeing from grinning satyrs. The murals were faded and cut by gashes of peeling plaster. Kira knocked at the door on the top of the stairs. Andrei Taganov opened it and stepped back, astonished. His eyes widened in the slow, incredulous glance of a man looking at a miracle that could not become habitual. He forgot to move. He stood before her, the collar of a white shirt thrown open at his sunburned throat. Kira! She laughed, a clear metallic laughter. How are you, Andre? His hands closed slowly, softly over her shoulders, so softly that she could not feel his hands, only their strength, their will holding her, bending her backward. But his lips on hers were brutal, uncontrollable. His eyes were closed, hers were open, looking indifferently up at the ceiling. Kira, I didn't expect you till tonight. I know, but you won't throw me out, will you? She stepped aside, preceding him through the dim little lobby into his room, throwing her bag on a chair, her hat on a table, and with imperious familiarity. She alone knew why Andrei Taganov had had to economize that winter, why he had given up his room and moved into an abandoned wing of the palace, which the party club could not use and had given to him free of rent. It had been the secret love nest of a prince. Many years ago, a forgotten sovereign had waited there for the light, stealthy footsteps and the rustle of a silk skirt up the long marble stairway. His magnificent furniture was gone, but the walls, the fireplace, and the ceilings remained. The walls were covered with a white brocade hand embroidered in delicate little wreaths of blue and silver leaves. A marble row of cupids with garlands and cornucopias spouting frozen white flowers encircled the cornice. A marble ladder reclined voluptuously in the embrace of white wings over the fireplace. And from the soft Blue of a sky painted on the ceiling among pale downy clouds, white doves that had watched long nights of luxurious orgies. Now looked at an iron bed, broken down chairs, a long unpainted table loaded with books in bright red covers, wooden boxes piled as a dresser, posters of Red Army soldiers hiding the splits in the white brocade, and a leather jacket hanging on a nail in a corner. Kira said peremptorily, peremptorily, I came now to tell you that I can't come tonight. Oh, you can't, Kira? No, I can't. Now don't look tragic. Here, I brought you something to cheer you up. She took a small toy from her pocket, a glass tube that ended in a bulb filled with a red liquid in which a little black figure floated, trembling. What's that? She held the bulb in her closed fist, but the little figure did not move. I can't do it. You try. Hold it this way. She closed his finger over the bulb. No expression, no movement of his told it to her, but she knew that he was not indifferent to the touch of her fingers on his, that all of the past winter had not made him accustomed and indifferent. The red liquid in the sealed tube spurted up suddenly in furious boiling bubbles. The little black horned figure jumped ecstatically up and down through the storm. See, they call it American Resident. I brought it on a street corner. Cute, isn't it? He smiled and watched the imp dancing. Very cute. Kira, why can't you come tonight? It's some business that I have to attend. Nothing important. Do you mind? No, not if it's inconvenient for you. Can you stay now? Only for a little while. She tore her coat off and threw it on the bed. Oh, Kira, like it? It's your own fault. On fault. You insisted on a new dress. The dress was red, very plain, very short, trimmed in black patent leather, a belt, 4 buttons, a flat round collar, and a huge bow. She stood leaning against the door, slouching a little, suddenly very fragile and young, a child's dress clinging to a body that looked as helpless and innocent as a child's, her tangled hair thrown back, her skirt high over slender legs pressed closely together, her eyes round and candid but her smile mocking and confident, her lips moist, wide. He stood looking at her, frightened by a woman who looked more dangerous, more desirable than he had ever known. She jerked her head impatiently. Well, you don't like it. Kira, you are. The dress is so lovely. I've never seen a woman's dress like that. What do you know about women's dress? Women's dresses. I looked through a whole magazine of Paris fashions at the Censorship Bureau yesterday. You looking through a fashion magazine? I was thinking of you. I wanted to know what women liked. And what did you learn? Things I would like you to have. Funny little hats and slippers like sandals with nothing but straps. And jewelry, diamonds. Andre, you didn't tell that to your comrades at the Censorship Bureau, did you? He laughed, still looking at her intently, incredulously. No, I didn't. Stop staring at me like that. What's the matter? Are you afraid to come near me? His fingers touched the red dress. Then his lips sank suddenly into the hollow of her naked elbow. He sat in the deep niche of the windowsill and she stood beside him, in the tight circle of his arms. His face was expressionless and only his eyes laughed soundlessly, cried to her soundlessly what he could not say. Then he was talking, his face buried in the red dress. You know, I'm glad you came now, instead of tonight. There were still so many hours to wait. I have never seen you like this. I've tried to read and I couldn't. Will you wear this dress next time? Was that your own idea, this leather bow? Why do you look so much more grown up in a childish dress like this? I like that bow. Kira, you know I've missed you so terribly. Even when I'm working, her eyes were soft, pleading, a little frightened. Andre, you shouldn't think of me when you're working. He said slowly without smiling. Sometimes it's only thoughts of you that help me through my work. Andre, what's the matter? But he was smiling again. Why don't you want me to think of you? Remember last time you were here, you told me about that book you read with a hero called Andre. And you said you thought of me. I've been repeating it to myself ever since and I brought the book. I know it isn't much, Kira, but Well, you don't say them often, things like that. She leaned back, her hands crossed behind her head, and mocking and irresistible. Oh, I think of you so seldom I've forgotten your last name. Hope I read it in a book. Why, I have even forgotten that scar right there, over your eye. Her finger was following the line of the scar sliding down his forehead, erasing his frown. She was laughing, ignoring the plea she had understood. Kira, would it cost so very much to install a phone in your house? But we have no electrical connections in the apartment. It's really impossible. I wish so often that you had a phone. Then I could call you once in a while. Sometimes it's so hard to wait just for you. Just wait for you. Don't I come here as often as you wish, Andre? It isn't that. Sometimes, you see, I just want to look at you. The same day you have been here, sometimes even a minute after you have left. It's that feeling that you're gone and I have no way of calling or finding you, no right to approach the house where you live, as if you had left the city. Sometimes I look at all these people in the streets and it frightens me. That feeling that you are lost somewhere among them and I can't get to you. I can't scream to you over all those heads. She said implacably, Andre, you have promised never to call at my house. But wouldn't you allow me to telephone? If we could arrange it? No, my parents might guess. And, oh, Andre, we have to be careful. We have to be so careful, particularly now. Why particularly now? Oh, no more than usual. It isn't so hard, is it? That one condition just to be careful? For my sake? No, dear. I'll come often. I'll still be here when you will become tired of me. Kira, why do you say that? Well, you will be tired of me someday, won't you? You don't think that, do you? She said hastily. No, of course not. Well, of course I love you. You know it. But I don't want you to feel that you are tired to me. You are tied to me. That your life. Kira, why don't you want me to say that my life? This is why I don't want you to say anything. She bent and closed his mouth with a kiss that hurted. Beyond the window, some club member in the palace was practicing the Internationale slowly with one hand on a sonorous concert piano. Andre's lips moved hungrily over her throat, her hands, her shoulders. He tore himself away with an effort. He made himself say lightly, gaily, as an escape rising, I have something for you, Kira. It was for tonight, but then he took a tiny box from a drawer from off his desk and pressed it to her hand. She protested helplessly. Oh, Andre, you shouldn't. I have asked you not to. With all you have done for me, and I have done nothing for you. I think you're too unselfish. It has always been your family. I've had to fight to have you get this dress. And the stockings, the lighter, and oh, Andre, I'm so grateful to you, but don't be afraid to open it. It was a small flat bottle of real French perfume. She gasped. She wanted to protest, but she looked at his smile and she could only laugh happily. Oh, Andre. His hand moved slowly in the air without touching her, following the line of her neck, her breast, her body, cautiously, attentively, as if modeling the statue. What are you doing, Andre? Trying to remember. What? Your body. As you stand, just now. Sometimes when I'm alone, I try to draw you in the air like this, to feel as if you are standing before me. She pressed herself closer to him. Her eyes were growing darker. Her smile seemed slow and heavy. She said, extending the perfume bottle, You must open it. I want you to give me the first drop. Yourself. She drew him down to her side on the bed. She asked, Where will you put it? His fingers, tips moist with the bewildering fragrance from another world, he pressed them timidly into her hair. She laughed defiantly. Where else? His fingertips brushed her lips. Where else? His hand drew a soft line down her throat, stopping abruptly at the black patent leather collar. Her eyes holding his, she jerked her collar, tearing the snaps of her dress open. Where else? He was whispering, his lips on her breast. Oh, Kira, Kira, I wanted you. Here, tonight. She leaned back, her face dark, challenging, pitiless, her voice low. I'm here now. But Why not? If you don't, I do. That's why I came. And as he tried to rise, her arms pulled him down imperiously. She whispered, Don't bother to undress. I haven't the time. He could forgive her the words, for he had forgotten them. When he saw her exhausted, breathing jerkily, her eyes closed, her head limp in the curve of his arm, he was grateful to her for the pleasure he had given her. He could forgive anything when she turned to him suddenly at the door, gathering her coat over the wrinkled red dress, when she whispered, her low voice pleading, wistful and tender, You won't miss me too much till next time, will you? I. I've made you happy, haven't I? She ran swiftly up the stairs to her apartment, the home that had been Admiral Kovalensky's. She unlocked the door, looking impatiently at her wristwatch. In the former drawing room, Marisha Lavrova was busy, standing over a primus, stirring a kettle of soup with one hand, holding a book in the other, memorizing aloud. The relationships of social class can be studied on the basis of the distribution of the economic means of production at any given historical. Kira stopped beside her. How's the Marxist theory, Marisha? She interrupted loudly, tearing her hat off, shaking her head. Here. Do you have a cigarette? Smoked my last one on the way home. Marisha nodded with her chin towards the dresser. In the drawer, she answered. Light one for me too, will you? How's things? Fine. Wonderful weather outside. Real summer. But busy. Uh-huh. Have to give a lecture at the club tomorrow on historical materialism. Kira lighted 2 cigarettes and stuck one into Marisha's mouth. Thanks. Marisha acknowledged, swirling the spoon in the thick mixture. Historical materialism and noodle soup. That's for a great guest. She winked slyly. Guess you know him. Name is Victor Donaev. I wish you luck. You and Victor both. Thanks. How's everything with you? Heard from the boyfriend lately? Kira answered reluctantly. Yes, I received a letter and a telegram. How is he getting along? When he's coming back? It was as if Kira's face had frozen suddenly into a stern, reverent calm. As if Marisha were looking again at the austere Kira of 8 months ago. She answered, Tonight. That brings us to the end of chapter 1, part 2, or chapter 18. Now we are going to read chapter 2 of part 2. A telegram lay on the table before Kira. It contained 4 words. Arriving June 5th, Leo. She had read it often, but 2 hours remained till the arrival of the Crimean train, and she could still reread it many times. She spread it out on the grey, faded satin cover of the bed and knelt by its side, carefully smoothing every wrinkle of the paper. It had 4 words, a word for every 2 months past. She wondered how many days she had paid for every letter. She did not try to think of how many hours and of what the hours had been. But she remembered how many times she had cried to herself, It doesn't matter. He will come back, saved. It had become so simple and so easy. If one could reduce one's life to but one desire, life could be cold, clear, and bearable. Perhaps others still knew that there were people, streets, and feelings. She didn't. She knew only that he would come back saved. It had been a drug and a disinfectant. It had burned everything out and left her icy, limpid, smiling. There had been her room, suddenly grown so empty that she wondered, bewildered, how 4 walls could hold such an enormous void. There had been mornings when she awakened to stare at a day as dim and hopeless as the grey square of snow clouds in the window. And it took her a tortured effort to rise, days when each step across the room was a conquest of will, when all the objects around her, the primus, the cupboard, the table, were enemies screaming to her of what they had shared with her, or what they had lost. But Leo was in the Crimea, where every minute was a ray of sunlight, and every ray of sunlight a new drop of life. There had been days when she fled from her room to people and voices, and fled from the people, for she found herself suddenly still lonelier. And she fled to wander through the streets, her hands in her pocket, her shoulders hunched, watching the sleigh runners, the sparrow, the snow around the lights, begging of them something she could not name. Then she returned home and lighted the burgoyse and ate a half-cooked dinner on a bare table, lost in her dim room, crushed under the huge sound of the locks crackling, the clock ticking on a shelf, hoops crunching snow beyond the window. But Leo drank milk and ate fruit with skins bursting into fresh, sparkling juice. There had been nights when she buried her head under the blanket and her face in the pillow, as if trying to escape from her own body. A body burning with the touch of a stranger's hand in the bed that had been Leo's. But Leo was lying on a bench by the sea and his body was growing suntanned. There had been moments when she saw in sudden astonishment as if she had not grasped it before, just what she was doing to her own body. Then she closed her eyes for behind that through thought that was another one. Thought was another one, more frightening, forbidden, of what she was doing to another man's soul. But Leo had gained 5 pounds and the doctors were pleased. There had been moments when she felt as if she were actually seeing the downward movement of her smiling mouth, the swift, peremptory wave of a long, thin hand, seeing them for a second briefer than lightning, and then her every muscle screamed with pain, so that she thought that she was not alone to hear it. But Leo wrote to her. She read his letters, trying to remember the inflection of his voice as it would pronounce each word. She spread the letters around her and sat in the room as with a living presence. He was coming back, cured, strong, saved. She had lived 8 months for one telegram. She had never looked beyond it. Beyond the telegram, there was no future. The train from the Crimea was late. Kira stood on the platform, motionless, looking at the empty track, two long bands of steel that turned to brass far away in the clear summer sunset beyond the terminal vaults. She was afraid to look at the wind clock and learn that which she had feared, that the train was hopelessly, indefinitely late. The platform trembled under the grating wheels of a heavy baggage truck. Somewhere in the long steel tunnel, a voice cried mournfully at regular intervals the same words that blended into one, like the call of a bird in the dusk. Grishka, shove it over. Boots shuffled lazily, aimlessly past her. Across the tracks, a woman sat on a bundle, her head drooping. The glass panes above were turning a desolate orange. The voice called plaintively, Grishka, shove it over. When Kira went to the office of the station commandant, the executive answered briskly that the train would be quite late, unavoidable delay, a misunderstanding at a junction. The train was not expected till tomorrow morning. She stood on the platform for a little while longer, aimlessly reluctant to leave the place where she had almost felt his presence. Then she walked out slowly, walked down the stairs, her arms limp, her feet lingering unsteadily on every step she descended. Far down at the end of the street, the sky was a flat band of bright, pure, motionless yellow, like the spilled yolk of an egg, and the street looked brown and white in a warm twilight. She walked away slowly. She saw a familiar corner past it, then came back and swerved into another direction towards the house of the Dunaevs. She had an evening that had to be filled. Irina opened the door. Her hair was wild, uncombed, but she wore a new dress of black and white striped batiste, and her tired face was powdered neatly. Well, Kira, of all people, what a rare surprise. Come in, take your coat off. I have someone to show you. And how do you like my new dress? Kira was laughing suddenly. She took off her coat. She wore a new dress of black and white striped batiste. Irina gasped. Oh, hell. When did you get it? About a week ago. I thought that if I got the plain stripes, I wouldn't see so many of them around. But the first time I wore it, I met 3 ladies in the same dress within 15 minutes. Oh, what's the use? Oh, well, come on. In the dining room, the windows were open and the room felt spacious, fresh with the soft clatter of the street. Vasily Ivanovich got up hastily, smiling, dropping tools and a piece of wood on the table. Victor rose gracefully, bowing. A tall, blond, husky young man jumped up and stood stiffly while Irina announced, 2 little twins from the Soviet Reformatory. Kira, may I present Sasha Sharnov. Sasha, my cousin. Kira Argonova. Sasha's hand was big and firm, and his handshake was too strong. He grinned shyly, a timid, candid, disarming grin. Sasha, this is a rare treat for you, said Irina. A rare guest, the recluse of Petrograd. Of Leningrad, Victor corrected. Of Petrograd, Irina repeated. How are you, Kira? I hate to admit how glad I am to see you. I'm delighted to meet you, Sasha muttered. I've heard so much about you. Without a doubt, said Victor. Kira is the most talked about woman in the city, and even in party circles. Kira glanced at him sharply, but he was smiling pleasantly. Glamorous women have always been an irresistible theme for admiring whisperers. Like Madame de Pompadour, for instance, charm refutes the Marxist theory. It knows no class distinction. Shut up, said Irina. I don't know what you're talking about, but I'm sure it's something rotten. Not at all, said Kira quietly, holding Victor's eyes. Victor is very complimentary, even though he does exaggerate. Awkwardly, diffidently, Sasha moved a chair for Kira, offering it to her silently with a wave of his hand and a helpless grin. Sasha is studying history, said Irina. That is, he was. He's been thrown out of the university for trying to think in a country of free thought. I will have you understand, Irina, said Victor, that I won't tolerate such remarks in my presence. I expect the party to be respected. Oh, stop acting, Irina snapped. The party collective won't hear you. Kira noticed Sasha's long, silent glare at Victor. Sasha's steely blue eyes were neither bashful nor friendly. I'm sorry about the university, Sasha, said Kira, feeling suddenly that she liked him. I did not mind, Sasha drawled in a quiet, measured tone of conviction. It really was not essential. There are some outward circumstances which an autocrat power can control. There are some values it can never reach nor subjugate. You will discover, Kira. Victor smiled coldly. That you and Sasha have much in common. You are both inclined to disregard the rudiments of caution. Victor, will you? Vasily Ivanovich began. Father, I have a right to expect, as long as I am feeding this family, that my views. You're feeding whom? A shrill voice asked from the next room. Asya appeared on the threshold, her stockings loose around her ankles, the shreds of a torn magazine in one hand and a pair of scissors in the other. I wish someone would feed someone. I'm still hungry and Irina wouldn't give me a second helping of soup. Father, I expect something to be done about this child, said Victor. She's growing up like a bum. If she were to join a children's organization such as the Pioneers. Victor, we won't discuss that again. Vasily Ivanovich interrupted firmly, quietly. Who wants to be a stinking pioneer? Asked Asya. Asya, you go back to your room, Irina ordered, or I'll put you to bed. You and who else? Stated Asya, disappearing behind a slammed door. Really, Victor observed. If I am able to study as I do and work besides and provide for this household, I don't see why Irina can't take proper care of one brat. No one answered. Vasily Ivanovich bent over the piece of wood he had been carving. Irina drew pictures with a spoon handle on the old tablecloth. Victor rose to his feet. Sorry, Kira, to desert such a rare guest, but I have to go. I have a dinner engagement. Sure, said Irina. See that the hostess doesn't borrow any silverware from Kira's room. Victor left. Kira noticed that the tools were trembling in Vasily Ivanovich's wrinkled fingers. What are you doing, Uncle Vasily? Making a frame? Vasily Ivanovich raised his head, showing his work proudly. For one of Irina's pictures. They are good pictures. It's a shame to let them get crumpled and ruined in a drawer. It's beautiful, Uncle Vasily. I didn't know you could do that. Oh, I used to be good at it. I haven't done it for years, but I used to be good in the old days, when I was young man, in Siberia. How's your job, Uncle Vasily? No more, said Irina. How long do you think one can keep a job in private store? What happened? Haven't you heard? They closed the store for back taxes, and the boss himself is now more broke than we are. Would you like some tea, Kira? I'll fix it. The tenant stole our primers, but Sasha will help me to light the samovar in the kitchen. Come on. She threw at him imperiously, and Sasha rose obediently. I don't know why I ask him to help, she winked at Kira. He's the most helpless, useless, awkward thing born. But her eyes were sparkling happily. She took his arm and wheeled him out of the room. It was growing dark and the open window was a sharp bright blue. Vasily Ivanovich did not light a lamp. He bent lower over his carving. Sasha is a nice boy, he said suddenly. And I'm worried. Why? Asked Kira. He whispered, Politics, secret societies, poor doomed little fool. And Victor suspects. I think so. It was Irina who switched on the light, returning with a sparkling tray of cups, preceding Sasha with a steaming samovar. Here's the tea and some cookies, I made them. See how you like them, Kira, for an artist cooking. How's the art, Irina? The job, you mean? Oh, I still have it, but I'm afraid I'm not good at drawing posters. I've been reprimanded twice in the wall newspaper. They said my peasant women looked like cabaret dancers and my workers were too graceful. My Burgoy's ideology, you know. Well, what do they want? It's not my specialty. I could scream sometimes. I can't get any ideas at all for one more of those damn posters. And now they have that competition, Vasily Ivanovich said mournfully. What competition? Irina spilled tea on the tablecloth. An inter-club competition. Who will make the most, the best, and the reddest posters have to work 2 hours extra every day, free, for the glory of the club. Under the Soviets, drawled Sasha, there is no exploitation. I thought, said Irina, that I had a good idea for a winner. A real proletarian wedding, a worker and a peasant woman on a tractor. God damn them. But I heard that the Club of Red Printers is making a symbolic one. The union of an airplane and a tractor. Sort of the spirit of electrification and proletarian state construction. And the wages? Sighed Vasily Ivanovich. She spent all her last month's salary on shoes for Russia. Well, said Irina, she couldn't go barefooted. Irina, you work too hard, Sasha remarked, and you take the work too seriously. Why waste your nerves? It's all temporary. It is, said Vasily Ivanovich. I hope it is, said Kira. Sasha is my lifesaver. Irina's weary mouth smiled tremulously and sarcastically all at once, as if trying to deny the involuntary tenderness in her voice. He took me to the theatre last week, and week before last we went to the Museum of Alexander III, and we wandered there for hours looking at the paintings. Leo is coming back tomorrow, Kira said suddenly, irrelevantly, as if she could not keep it any longer. Oh, Irina's spoon clattered down. You never told us. I'm so glad. And he's quite well? Yes, he was to return tonight, but the train is late. How is his aunt in Berlin? Asked Vasily Ivanovich. Still helping you? There's an example of family loyalty. I have the greatest admiration for that lady, even though I've never seen her. Anyone who is safe, away, free, and can still understand us, buried alive in this Soviet graveyard, must be a wonderful person. She has saved Leo's life. Uncle Vasily, said Kira, when you see Leo, will you remember never to mention it? His aunt's help, I mean. You remember I explained to you how sensitive he is about being under obligation to her, and so we'll all be careful not to remind him of it, will we? Certainly, I understand, child. Don't worry. But that's Europe for you. That's abroad. That's what a human life does to a human being. I think it's hard for us to understand kindness and what used to be cold ethics. We're all turning into beasts into a beastly struggle. But we'll be saved. We'll be saved before it gets us all. We don't have long to wait, said Sasha. Kira noticed a frightened, pleading look in Irina's eyes. It was late when Kira and Sasha rose to go. He lived far on the other side of the city, but he offered to escort her home, for the streets were dark. He wore an old coat and he walked fast, slouching. They hurried together through a soft, transparent twilight through the city full of the fragrance of a warm earth somewhere far under the pavements and cobblestones. Irina isn't happy, he said suddenly. No, said Kira. She isn't. No one is. We are living in difficult times, but things will change. Things are changing. There still are men to whom freedom is more than a word on posters. Do you think they have a chance, Sasha? His voice was low, tense with a passionate conviction, a quiet strength that made her wonder why she had ever thought him bashful. Do you think the Russian worker is a beast that licks its yoke while his mind is being battered out of him? Do you think he's fooled by the clatter of a very noisy gang of tyrants? Do you know what he reads? Do you know the books that are hidden in the factories? The papers that pass secretly through many hands? Do you know that the people is awakening and... Sasha, she interrupted. Aren't you playing a very dangerous game? He did not answer. He looked at the old roofs of the city against a milky bluish sky. The people, she said, has claimed too many victims already, of your kind. Russia has a long revolutionary history, he said. They know it. They are even teaching it in their schools. But they think it's ended. It isn't. It's just beginning. and it has never lacked men who did not think of the danger in the Cesar's days or at any other time. She stopped and looked at him in the dusk and said desperately, forgetting that she had met him for the first time but a few hours ago, "Oh, Sasha, is it worth the chance you are taking?" He towered over her, strands of blonde hair sticking out from under his cap, his mouth grinning slowly over the raised collar of his coat. "You must not worry, Kira. And Irina must not worry. I'm not in danger. They won't get me. They won't have the time." In the morning, Kira had to go to work. She had insisted on working. Andre had found a job for her, the job of lecturer and excursion guide in the Museum of the Revolution. The job consisted of sitting at home and waiting for a call from the excursion center. When they called, she hurried to the museum and led a group of bewildered people through the halls of what had been the Winter Palace. She received a few rubles for each excursion. She was listed as the Soviet employee by the upravdom of her house. It saved her from an exorbitant rent and from the suspicion of being burgoyse. In the morning, she had telephoned the Nikolevsky station. The train from the Crimea was not expected until early in the afternoon. Then the excursion center called her. She had to go. The halls of the Winter Palace displayed faded photographs of revolutionary leaders, yellowed proclamations, maps, diagrams, models of Czarist prisons, rusty guns, splinters of leg irons. 30 workers were waiting in the palace lobby for the comrade guide. They were on vacation, but their educational club had arranged the excursion and they could not ignore its commands. They removed their caps respectfully and shuffled timidly, obediently after Kira, and listened attentively, scratching their heads. And this photograph, comrades, was taken just before this execution. Before his execution, he was hanged for the assassination of a tyrant, one of the Czar's henchmen. Such was the end of another glorious victim on the tortuous path of the worker peasant revolution. And this diagram, comrades, gives us a clear visual illustration of the strike movement in Czarist Russia. You will note that the red line drops sharply after the year 1905. Kira recited her lecture evenly, mechanically. She was no longer conscious of words. It was nothing but a succession of memorized sounds, each dragging the next one automatically. Without any assistance of will, she did not know what she was going to say. She knew that her hand would rise at a given word and point at the right picture. She knew at which word the grey, impersonal blood that was her audience would laugh, and at which word it would gasp and grunt with social indignation. She knew that her listeners wanted her to hurry and that the excursion center wanted the lecture to be long and detailed. And this, comrades, is the genuine carriage in which Alexander True was riding on the day of his assassination. This shattered back was torn by the bomb in the hands of... But she was thinking of the train from Crimea. Perhaps it had arrived. Perhaps the lonely room she hated had now become a temple. Comrade Guide, could you tell if Alexander II was paid by international imperialists? The room was empty when she came home. "No," said Marisha. "He hasn't arrived." "No," said the gruff voice over the telephone. "The train isn't in. Is that you again, citizen? What's the matter with you? Trains aren't run for your personal convenience. It's not expected until tonight." She took off her coat. She raised her hand and glanced at her wristwatch. Her hand froze in mid-air. She remembered whose gift it was. She took the watch off and threw it into a drawer. She curled in an armchair by the window and tried to read a newspaper. The newspaper slipped to the floor. She sat still, her hand on her arm. It was an hour later that she heard steps behind the door and the door was thrown open without a knock. The first thing she saw was a dusty suitcase. Then she saw the smile, the drooping lips arched over very white teeth in a tanned face. Then she stood with the back of her hand at her mouth and could not move. He said, "Hello, Kira." She did not kiss him. Her hands fell on his shoulders and moved down his arms, all her weight in her fingers. For she was sagging suddenly and her face was sliding slowly down his chest, down the cloth of his coat, and as he tried to lift her head, she pressed her mouth to his hand and held it. Her shoulders jerked. She was sobbing. "Kira, you little fool." He was laughing softly. His fingers caressed her hair. The fingers were trembling. He lifted her in his arm and carried her to the armchair and sat down, holding her on his lap, forcing her lips to meet his. "And that's the strong Kira who never cries." You shouldn't be so glad to see me, Kira. Stop it, Kira, you little fool. My dearest, dearest. She tried to get up. Leo, you must take your coat off and stay still. He held her, and she leaned back, and she felt suddenly that she had no strength to lift her arms, and she had no strength ever to move again. And the Kira who despised femininity smiled a tender, radiant, trusting smile, weaker than a woman's, the smile of a lost, bewildered child, her lashes heavy and sparkling with tears. He looked at her, his eyes half closed, and his glance was insulting in its open, mocking understanding of his power, a glance more voluptuous than a lover's caress. Then he turned away and asked, "Was it terribly hard for you this winter?" "A little, but we don't have to talk about it. It's past. Do you cough anymore, Leo?" "No." "And you're well?" Quite completely well? Free to live again?" "I am well, yes. As to living again," he shrugged. His face was tanned, his arm was strong. His cheeks were not hollow any longer, but she noticed something in his eyes that had not been cured, something that perhaps had grown beyond cure. She said, "Leo, isn't the worst of it over? Aren't we ready now to begin?" "Begin with what? I have nothing to bring back to you but a healthy body." "What else can I want?" "Nothing else from a gigolo." "Leo!" "Well, am I not one?" "Leo, don't you love me?" "I love you. I love you too much. I wish I didn't. It would all be so simple if I didn't. But to love a woman and to see her dragging herself through this hell they call life here, and not to help her, but to let her drag you instead. Did you really think I would bless this health you gave back to me? I hate it because you gave it back to me, and because I love you." She laughed softly. "Would you rather hate me too?" "Yes, I would rather. You are that which I have lost long ago, but I love you so much that I am trying to hold on to it, to that which you think I am, which I know I was, even though I can't hold on much longer. And that's all I have to offer you, Kira." She looked up at him quietly, and her eyes were dry, and her smile was not a child's and stronger than a woman's. She said, "There is only one thing that matters, and we'll remember, and that we will remember. The rest doesn't matter. I don't care what life is to be, nor what it does to us, but it won't break us. Neither you nor me. That's our only weapon. That's the only banner we can hold against all those around us. That's all we have to know about the future." He said more tenderly and more earnestly than she had ever heard him say, "Kira, I wish you weren't what you are." Then she buried her face on his shoulder and whispered, "And we won't ever be talking about it again. And now we don't have to talk at all, do we? I have to get up and powder my nose, and you have to take that coat off and take a bath, and I'll fix you some lunch. But first, let me sit with you for just a few moments. Just sit still. Don't move, Leo." Her head slid slowly to his breast, to his knees, to his feet. That brings us to the end of chapter 2 or chapter 19th of part 2. I will be ending the stream. There are no comments as such. Yeah. Okay. If you like, share, and subscribe. Do let me know if there are any kind of comments, positive, negative, feedback, suggestions, recommendations, anything is welcome in the comment section of the video you're viewing or in the community section. Bye bye for now. Keep reading. Take care.